Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on installing your OCS. It's a relatively short one this week. It's about 15 minutes. And if you have any questions, we can get to those at the end as well. So let's kick it off.
Welcome to today's tutorial. Let's get started. Let's have a look at our agenda for today. Today we're talking about installing your OCS. We'll start by talking about the differences between when you would mount your OCS controller through the enclosure door and when you might put it inside the control panel. We'll also talk about some environmental considerations that come into play, and we'll talk about the standard OCS ratings. Then we'll talk about what you can do when dealing with the elements issues that can occur with temperature, UV, sunlight and condensation, which you need to consider if you're installing your OCS outdoors. Then we'll finish with a Q&A session. Let's start by talking about mounting the OCS controller the traditional way on the door. So why would you do that? Well, through the door is the traditional mounting location for operator interfaces for machine control. And the OCS, of course, has a built-in operator interface. So wiring that and putting that on the door makes a lot of sense. Now, some people may think of the built-in I/O in the back of every OCS, and they're concerned about the amount of wiring that may be running along the hinge. However, it can be a real positive because it gives you the flexibility to use some of that built-in I/O for the operators that may be present on the door itself, such as the push buttons, pilot lights, etc. Those wires which normally would be run along the hinge to the backplate can go right to the I/O on the back of the OCS. Also, with the OCS mounted on the door, when you open up that control cabinet, you have access to all the wiring and cabling on the back of the OCS. So all the I/O wiring and all the networking is available and easy to work on. Another advantage to having it on the door is that you get better access to the drives that are located on the controller. The microSD and the mini USB are easily available when you open up that door of the control enclosure. With USB, you have the option of also using an IP rated extension cable, meaning you don't have to open the door at all in order to plug in and out your USB drive. The same thing can be done with mini USB as well for programming. So what's the process for installing the OCS on the enclosure door? Well, it's very straightforward. You start with the appropriate cutout, and it's always best if you can to order your enclosure pre-laser cut with the appropriate cutout. If not, and you're using one of the OCS models that uses a standard cutout, you could use a 1/4 DIN hole punch, for example, in order to make that cutout. There's other ways you can get that cutout sized appropriately with the appropriate amount of tolerance. Once you have that cutout squared away, then you remove all the removable terminal blocks from your OCS, slide it through the cutout from the outside, and then start clamping it down by fixing those clamps. They come in your install package to the door. If you have an issue where a clamp is walking away from the OCS or it's not perfectly square as you're tightening it down, a tip here is to use a small square of masking tape on the smooth surface on the inside of the door at the point where the fastener for the clamp makes contact with the door. That small bit of friction will help discourage that clamp fastener from walking away from the OCS. Generally though, that's something that you don't need to do. For the actual cutout size itself, at Horner we do our best to limit the number of cutout options available because the more models that will work with the same cutout, the more options our customers have in terms of using the same panel cutout for multiple OCS models. So the cutout on the center of this diagram is compatible with a variety of different models. We call that the universal cutout. It's the traditional size for a 5.7-inch touchscreen, but we've kept that same cutout size. And now that cutout can be used with the EXL6, the EXLW, the XL Prime equivalent of those products, as well as the micro OCS X7 and X10. Even the XL Plus will all fit through that cutout hole to give customers more flexibility and options to change out the OCS to a different model without changing the cutout size. Now let's talk about when you would mount your OCS controller on the backplate. First of all, why would you do that? One reason is because the OCS is an excellent PLC. In some applications, they don't require a local operator interface, and you'll have customers that will start looking for a controller that doesn't have a local screen. But the reality is, having that extra screen, of course, does not make the OCS a worse PLC. It actually makes it better because not only can you mount that inside the enclosure like a traditional PLC, but you can also utilize the screen graphics for all kinds of local diagnostics. So when you're doing some machine troubleshooting, you'll have all those graphics available giving the status and diagnostics you need. Also, in remote applications where you don't have an operator around, having that unit inside the enclosure also keeps the OCS away from harsh environments. So that's another good reason to mount the OCS on the backplate inside the enclosure. Another reason to do it is because the XLE, XLT, and even the XL4 are excellent remote I/O blocks as well, especially for things like Ethernet IP, Modbus TCP, etc. We've done webinars which you can view on the Horner website showing all these steps with example programs to take an XLE for instance and turn it into a remote I/O block. In that case, you may choose to mount that XLE in the panel on the backplate for that application. Now let's talk about which models are easiest to mount on the backplate. Starting with the quarter DIN controllers, quarter DIN is a standard cutout size and we have 4 different products that utilize that same cutout. The XLE, XLT, XL4 and the XL4 Prime. All those products fit through a quarter DIN cutout and they also include a DIN rail clamping system built into the back cover. For the larger models like the 6-inch, 7-inch and even the 10-inch models, they also use that same back plastic, so that DIN rail clamp is still there. But really you should only use that on the bench and not for permanent installation. But if you're using one of the quarter DIN models, that built-in clamping system works really well. Now let's talk about some environmental considerations for your application. We'll start by talking about the standard environmental specs for OCS. For all those models on the screen, which is almost every OCS we sell today, there's the standard specifications that are available for OCS. There's an operating temperature range from -10 to +60 degrees Celsius and relative humidity with a wide range of 5 to 95%, and that's non-condensing. All of the OCS models have a UL type rating that includes 1, 12, 12K, 13, 4 and 4X. You can see the rest of the ratings for shock and vibration as well. For those with lower temperature applications or below -10 degrees Celsius, we also offer several models with an integral 24 volt DC heater. That heater, again powered from 24 volts DC, uses an internal thermostat, so there's no extra control required. There's also no AC power that has to be run to the system. With those models, you can use them all the way down to -40 degrees Celsius, which also happens to be the same as -40 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have a colder temperature application, you might want to consider the -22 part number extension, which will give you this extra operating range without losing any of your UL approvals. Now let's talk about specific elements that can be a challenge, starting with temperature. Keep in mind the OCS ratings are conservative for temperature and for other elements as well, but you shouldn't ignore them. Some of the components are more impacted by temperature than others. That starts with batteries, and this isn't unique to Horner, this is the case for all batteries. With batteries, if they're used at extreme temperatures, their lifetime is reduced. And that's true whether it's a rechargeable battery or a traditional coin cell, for instance. If you're using a rechargeable battery and you're at extreme temperatures, whether low or high, your batteries won't be able to recharge. Another component that's impacted by temperature extremes are touchscreens. The screen contrasts get thrown off in very hot or very cold temperatures. With hot temperatures especially, the screen can go darker. In cold temperatures, the screen can get slow. Touch sensitivity can also be impacted by temperature in a lot of cases, which reduces the sensitivity of the touchscreen. So again, even though the OCS has very robust conservative ratings, don't ignore the temperature ratings because some of the components at some point are going to be affected. Another area that people sometimes don't think about when it comes to the environment is condensation. You really need to be aware of condensation. Sudden temperature swings can cause condensation inside your control cabinet, which can cause problems with electrical devices as well as electronic devices like OCS products. When you have condensation, you're risking damage to those electronics from short circuits or corrosion. The good news is there are ways of fighting condensation. One thing you can do is control the temperature inside your enclosure through heating, cooling, or both. Another thing that you can do that's inexpensive is use Gore-Tex breather valves that can help equalize the airflow between the inside and the outside of the enclosure. That's good for equalizing pressure as well as air temperature. These breather valves are not expensive and they're really easy to install. So do some research on those if you have an application where condensation could be an issue because of temperature swings. Another thing to look out for in terms of environmental exposure is UV. UV, which obviously comes from the sun, can really damage industrial rated products. It can cause plastic housings to become brittle and break, and it can also take clear overlays that are used on top of screens and over time make them cloud over and also become brittle and lose their seal. At Horner, we do our part by spending more money on UV stable plastic than our competition does. We don't use the cheapest possible plastic. Our plastic housings are made from UV stable material. Also, our overlays are made from UV stable material, so you won't see them cloud up and you won't see them crack because of exposure to UV. But be aware when you're using industrial devices and they're exposed to UV, as you can have some issues. Following on from UV, let's talk about sunlight. There's a lot of problems sunlight can have. With industrial applications located outdoors, it can cause the rapid heating of an enclosure, which is one of the causes or one of the enablers of condensation. It can also cause the superheating of air. If you're using one of those screen protective windows that leaves a pocket of air between the protective window and the outside of the control enclosure, you need to be careful. If you're using one of those products and there's a pocket of air and you're not properly venting it, the sun can superheat that air with the greenhouse effect, and this can get very hot. Also, UV damage can occur over time, as we just talked about. Another big problem can be the inability to read the screen when you have direct sunlight glaring on it. There are some solutions for these issues. One thing that's a relatively simple solution, but you need to think ahead to implement, is to orient the control cabinet with the sun's direction in mind. So if possible, instead of pointing it straight south, you may want to have it in a different direction if you have that flexibility. Also, if you're using one of those screen windows over the outside to protect your controller, make sure you've properly vented it. And if you've got one of those locations that's a problematic location because of glare, or maybe you just want to provide some extra protection, a folding cover like I'm showing there on the screen is a really nice option. It's folded down normally, which provides total protection against UV and the sun's rays, and then when you need to use the screen, you can fold it out and it becomes a hood that can protect against glare so you can see the screen better. So that's something I would explore if I was installing an OCS outdoors. Another solution in general that people should consider, not necessarily just for outdoor applications, is the use of an interior door or a swing panel in your control enclosure. This is often a good solution for those applications where the environment is severe, but that doesn't have to be outdoors. This is also good if you don't have to have the operator in front of the screen all day long, and they just need to use it occasionally. So when you're using an interior door or an interior swing panel, an OCS of any size can be mounted like it traditionally is, just on the swing panel or interior door itself instead of the exterior door. So whenever the operator needs to use that particular screen, they open up the external door and the OCS is there installed and ready to work on. Then they can open up the swing panel and they have complete access to all the wiring. So that's a nice solution that you should consider on a variety of different applications. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining me for today's tutorial, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, relatively short this morning. I don't see anything coming in regarding questions on that. So next week we do have an inside look into the new XL Prime series. So hopefully all of you will be at that to get a feel for the new product. Other than that, I'm not seeing any last minute questions coming in. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next week.